I've always wanted to do that. Anyway, sorry.
Your drink bottle is useful for something.
Put some more water in and see if it changes.
Hopefully that discussion was useful and we didn't cut anyone off at the pass. At the risk of getting into the weeds, and there'll be an opportunity for free-range discussion later on, but is there anything anyone wants to comment on or question at this stage before we get into the boundary options?
I was just going to say the observation we made is that population growth across the whole district, based on those census figures, is 5% for Timaru, 6 for Temuka Point and 6 for Geraldine. So there's, assuming that's pretty consistent, you kind of wonder why there's a need to change.
It's a workshop.
There's a workshop, there's no standing orders.
Any other questions or observations at this point? Very true. Okay, no worries. Like I said, there'll be an opportunity for free-range discussion later on. What I want to do now is look at some boundary options that we were asked to go away and reflect on, and discuss some of the pros and cons of each. To start with, the 2018 situation, as per the last representation review, if this clicker will work nicely, basically meant that we ended up with 3 wards, and all of them were had populations where the number of elected members relative to the number of voters meant that they were within the plus or minus 10% as required by legislation, at least in the first instance, and noting that these numbers don't include the mayor. Moving on, the latest data from Stats NZ shows that due to growth in certain areas or decline in others, and how that aligns to existing boundaries, ward boundaries, Geraldine is now underrepresented slightly relative to the others. Timaru still basically bang on, and Pleasant Point, Temuka heading to be slightly overrepresented. What that then means is we have a few decisions to be made. So let's look through a few options. Option number 1, for instance, and Malcolm Alexander did allude to this in some respects, and I'd like to go through it in a little bit more detail with you. Option 1, which you could look to do, would be to retain the current boundaries if you thought that they accurately reflected your communities of interest. You could then do one of 2 things. You could choose to amend the number of elected members that you have representing those wards so that the overall calculation, the plus or minus 10% for each of the 3, is within that threshold. And what that might look like, for example, if the clicker will work again, for Geraldine, the current number of elected members is 1. If you were to change that to 2, have another elected member for Pleasant Point, Temuka, have another 4 for Timaru, and have 15 in total, then what that would then mean would be that your overall 3 are within the plus or minus 10%. Now, to be very clear, that's a drastic and significant increase from in terms of the number of elected members, and that requires careful consideration. But that's just an illustration of how you could keep the existing boundaries but meet the plus or minus 10%. And one of the exercises that we're going to do later on is, through that link that we've sent you, allow you to play around with these numbers so that you can see what amending the number of elected members per any particular ward would do, because it can get quite messy quite quickly. The other thing that you could do, if you thought that your current boundaries were accurate and reflected your communities of interest accurately, is you could say, we're happy with the status quo, and self-report yourself to the Local Government Commission for a determination. As the maps show, on page 2, there's a table that we've provided, And that just shows some of the recent local government determinations relating to the plus or minus 10%. And you can see, they're based on council's final proposals, and you can see that in the past approximately 5 years, there have been around 21 that have gone to the Local Government Commission, and for a number of valid reasons, they were successful in 18 of those. Now, to be very clear, we provide this information to give you context. We're not trying to steer you in any particular direction. And your first objective as a council must be to attempt to comply with the legislation with the plus or minus 10%.
Excuse me, Brendan, do we know how many got declined? Because I got the impression from the last workshop that we had no hope, sorry to stop there, of getting that accepted. So of the 18 that it got accepted, was that 18 out of 18 or?
So what I did was go through the Local Government Commission website. There are probably about 40 determinations there, of which half might have applied to plus or minus 10%. The other half might have applied to, some other factor, number of elected members, for instance, or the like. Of the 21 applications within that period where there was a ward or wards outside the plus or minus 10%, 18 of those were successful, and there are some reasons why. On the next slide, I believe, if this works.
So 3 were declined, were they?
Three, yeah. Yeah, correct, yeah. And they were declined or partially declined for a number of reasons. For example, Hauraki in particular, the bottom one for being partially declined, was of particular interest to me. So in their example, they had 5 wards, one of which was slightly outside the plus or minus 10%, and they self-reported themselves to the Local Government Commission. The Local Government Commission said, we like your boundaries, we think you've correctly identified your communities of interest, however, adding or changing that particular non-compliant ward from 2 to 3 members and the cascading effect of that on the other 4 wards meant that suddenly all 5 wards were within the plus or minus 10%. So they said, yes, there are valid reasons why wards might be not compliant with the plus or minus 10%, but if there's they call it statistical entitlement to an additional representative, and that's not necessarily a drastic change, and I would suggest that what we've got there in terms of the change from 9 to 15 elected members to make it work is more significant than the Hauraki example, then that statistical entitlement doesn't override that non-compliance, if that makes sense. If the clicker will work, I just want to go through this. So that there is the map of the current boundaries, to be clear, and you've got that. So the legislation provides 3 reasons why, or 3 grounds for potentially being outside the plus or minus 10%. I won't go through all of them, but they're in detail, but they're outlined on that table in terms of it might be that there's an island or isolated community. Think, for example, Stewart Island, Banks Peninsula, or it might be that drawing the boundary in a particular way will either divide a community of interest arbitrarily or unite communities of interest that have few other commonalities. So in that sense, it's an artificial boundary which is designed only to comply with the legislation rather than provide effective representation to their community. Does that answer your question? I hope so. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay, please let me know if there are.
Sorry, just an observation, Brendan. That's why the exercise we did earlier was quite critical in terms of representing to the Local Government Commission to support any boundary change or the maintenance of that status quo. So it's actually going through an understanding and recognising that we actually do understand those communities of interest really well.
Just before I move on to option 2, the key point of option 1 here is to let you know that you have an option if you think you've identified your communities of interest accurately and the current boundaries accurate. You have the option to apply to be outside the plus or minus 10%. We can't advise what the Local Government Commission, how they might view that, but you know that there's an option and that there's some precedent for that. Right, moving on then to option number 2, specifically 2A and 2B. Now this draws off some of the work that was done in the previous workshop and since. There was, as we understand it, some guidance from the last workshop that elected members wanted to see some more work around moving the boundary around Orari. So what we've done, Mark, Tash and myself, is take what was the old option 1 and the old option 3 and work on them a little bit more and update them with the numbers and the like. To be clear, we didn't include what was the old option 2 because there appeared to be a lack of appetite to split the Orari community arbitrarily, and indeed, if that is the case, that's reinforced from other local government commission determinations. So in that sense, the old option 1, which is now 2A, to move the entire community from one ward to another, or option 3, split them following Stat Highway 1 as close as possible within the constraints of the mesh blocks, generates the following result. Bear in mind, these were designed by Malcolm and Tash to be compliant with the plus or minus 10% rule, and that was based on the 2022 estimates. It's still the case with the 2023 estimates. Bear in mind, these numbers don't include the mayor or any at-large members, which you currently don't have, but you can choose to have. So, what I'll do at this point is just pause to see if there's any comment or discussion or guidance around whether or not you like the idea of moving Orari from one ward to another in part or in full, bearing in mind that this discussion should be, or your comments or observations should be informed by the community of interest exercise that you've undertaken.
Did you consider going down in numbers? Did you consider going down? You've gone up. Did you look at going the other way?
Do you mean in terms of elected members? So those elected members that are there in 2A and 2B are the current numbers of elected members, and it's illustrative only. What we'll do a little bit later on in the workshop is give you these models, these spreadsheets, so that you can, we can do it collectively, dynamically. We can play around with different numbers of elected members so that you can see what making a change here or there might do. We did consider providing that modelling to you at the outset. However, because there are so many different options in terms of how to tweak the number of elected members, within each of these options, and we're presenting 5 to you today, we'd be presenting effectively 30 or 35 different options to you, and we thought that was probably not very helpful. So we're aiming to do that a little bit more at the end. So firstly, reflecting on the communities of interest. Secondly, seeing how our boundaries align with that, regardless of what it does to the plus or minus 10%. And then thirdly, doing what you've asked in terms of having a look at the number of elected members to see how that factors into the overall situation. So yes, we've looked at how changing the number of elected members might impact it, and the numbers that you're seeing here are just an example.
Have you got some information around comparisons between different areas and the numbers each councillor is representing?
We do have that. I don't have it off the top of my computer for you today, but we have looked at that, and I could find that for you. For instance, we're going to have a break whilst you play around with the spreadsheets, the models for the number of elected members. I can find that information for you whilst we do that, and I could bring that back to you a little bit later in the workshop in about 50 minutes or so.
I was just reading the Christchurch stuff. There are like 17 councillors, probably 500,000 people.
Yep.
So,
and Auckland is 20 for 1.5 million.
yeah.
Yep.
So, those numbers are considerably different to what we're talking about here.
Yep. Absolutely, quite correct observation. The key thing to reflect on there, I suppose, is Number one, what is required to give fair and effective representation to any particular community? So, for example, larger communities as opposed to larger districts, TAs, as opposed to smaller ones, might require more in order for effective representation. Auckland, for example, Christchurch, they have very significant community or local boards that they empower to do quite a lot of work for the main council, so that's all part of the mix as well. Yeah, that's why reflecting on community boards is part of this representation review exercise. Any comments on that? No? Okay. And so, like I say, just wondering if at this point there are any questions, observations around moving Orari or any other part of the district from one ward to another to attempt to get within the plus or minus 10%.
We
Yeah,
were
I guess.
probably 2 or 3 to 1. That Orari belonged probably more with Geraldine than Temuka. We were probably 2 or 3 to 1. That Orari probably belonged more with Geraldine than Temuka, as we felt they would probably be more connected with that. Scotty chose to disagree, but
Surely he's just growing the Temuka empire.
yeah.
And I hope the camera recorded that. And just for the record, what factors made you think that Orari might be more closely linked with Geraldine? Was it transport? Was it schooling? Something else?
Probably schooling, I think, yeah. And just being that, I'm only kind of guessing here, but being that little bit further away from Temuka, you'd probably gravitate to Geraldine for the supermarket, doctors and things like that, I think, yeah.
Any other view? Yep.
Yeah, I guess considering the electorate, how they move the electorate lines around, and you know, Geraldine now is part of the Waitaki, it used to be, and they just basically cut and dice as they see is necessary to balance those numbers. And to be fair, as long as they've got someone that's representing them, that's the most important thing. So, I mean, your option 2A makes quite a bit of sense to me, and I can't see why the people at Orari are still going to get representation. That just means that there's someone else, and they just talk to someone else when they pick the phone up. So I guess that's my
You can
opinion.
leave that on. I think if you're going to take Orari into Temuka, you take the whole of Orari and not split the community. I don't think that would be helpful for the community.
Yeah, I'd agree with Councillor Parker on that one. I think you can't split up Orari, surely. One side of the road for one side for the other. No, it has to be all-encompassing, I think.
Any other questions, comments, disagreements?
Don't worry, I'm not going to disagree with you. I think at the end of the day, like, as we did discuss, if you were to get our community members and hand them this blank map and draw where they thought the boundaries were, I would challenge that even one could do it. At the end of the day, Alan Booth is correct. You know, the people just want represented. Don't put that on a T-shirt. Yeah. Goodness me. Well, too late to walk it back, am I? At the end of the day, it's about representation, isn't it? And I think that your community, so long as they're satisfied that they have representation and quality representation, the boundaries don't matter. Because the boundaries at the end of the day, even though they're a line on the map, they are blurred. They are quite blurred, you know.
We talk about that too, and where there's communities like Rangitata Huts, for instance, it's something that the councillors from both Temuka Point Ward and Geraldine Ward would go down and meet with those communities. So you kind of, there's crossover points anyway.
Yeah, my feeling there is that Orari people probably do align more with Geraldine folk in all kinds of ways. It's just their utilisation of things, the facilities in our place and schooling and so on. The Kākahu area, we haven't talked about much, but I think those bods very much align with Geraldine. So that's the other dark blue patch there, more out to the west.
Any comments on that?
The reality is, you go into either of those blue blocks and I can find you people that align. You know, it's easy enough to say these people in this area align themselves with this place and think that encompasses everybody, but it doesn't, and it doesn't in any of these cases.
And two observations before we move on. The first is the Local Government Commission acknowledges that the further you get from a main centre, the more one's identity or sense of distinction blurs. Perfectly fine and valid. And the second thing is the process is designed to have the opportunity for change and feedback baked into it. So, for example, whatever council chooses at a later date to make as an initial proposal, there'll be community consultation based on that, and that may reinforce what your thinking is, or it may challenge that, but it can all be factored into the process. Okay. It sounds like we're quite comfortable to move on. What I'd like to do at this point is hand over to Mark to explain the next bit. All right, we've sort of moved on beyond that anyway, really.
Well, we sort of moved on beyond that, but this is, we had over the course of the past couple of weeks, as we've worked through this process, debated a number of principles, I guess, and one was how a township would feel if it was, in fact, divided and divided by lines. And flippantly, we thought that there could be two potential options. One was to approach NZTA and see if they'd move the highway through Orari. High degree of success we factored was probably going to come from that. The other was to approach Land Information New Zealand and see if they would move the mesh blocks to satisfy us. We figured that that was probably not going to, so we scarpered that. That actually isn't a nuclear bomb on Orari itself to deal with an issue. It's just dealing with that part of our option analysis.
Thank you, Mark. Moving on. Okay.
My work here is done.
So one of the other options or bits of feedback that we picked up from one of the previous workshops was what might adding a fourth ward look like? And again, that comes back to, do we have the communities of interest correct? Is there a fourth distinct community of interest relative to the current three that needs to be represented? So just as an illustrative example of this, to start the discussion, the simplest thing that we could do as a team was to split Pleasant Point Temuka, the current ward, into two, based on their community board boundaries, and see what that would do in terms of the threshold. So you can see on the right-hand side there that Geraldine would still be overrepresented, Pleasant Point significantly underrepresented, Temuka underrepresented, and Timaru still bang on correct. What this, as I say, simply means is, to give you an illustration of what adding that fourth ward might look like, the question that you need to ask yourselves is there a desire for a fourth ward? Is there a fourth community of interest that needs to be represented? So I'll pause at that point to see if there's any comments or discussion.
Was it once like that? Like, was Pleasant Point its own and Temuka? What's the history there? Or
I couldn't give you the exact history, but I know that back in the 70s and 80s, before the local government reforms, that there were various different councils, like a Geraldine Council, a Strathallan Council, etc. I believe that since the 1990s or so, we've had a three-ward system in Timaru district, that is.
Is there another option of just having Timaru and one other ward, as in Geraldine, Temuka, Pleasant Point, all as one?
There certainly is that option if the council believes that that reflects the communities of interest appropriately, i.e. someone who lives within Timaru Township is significantly distinct and requires different representation from someone who lives in those other townships versus, say, people who live rurally. That's absolutely something that we could model up. But it goes back to your reflection and consideration of what your communities of interest are and how they should be represented. I'm not hearing any overwhelming desire for a fourth ward.
I think it'd be interesting to know what the Pleasant Point community think, given they have two Temuka-based councillors this time round.
And also,
Anna's not hearing them, is she?
no,
Yeah.
no, she's not. And also, I have always found it intriguing that West Timaru was part of the Pleasant Point Temuka ward, and having a lot to do with the Pleasant Point community of late, and also having family connections out there, and it possibly goes back to when they closed the high school there, that a lot of Pleasant Point people align themselves more with Timaru, whether they live in the country, work in town, or send their kids into high schools in Timaru, and they do that before they'll do that to Geraldine or Timaru. So the Pleasant Point around the back of Timaru as a ward, it does actually make sense to me, to be fair.
It's not my area, so take this with a grain of salt and all, but I feel as though it's an easier shift to make, and most particularly, it's not going to affect anybody in terms of their schooling or where they shop at the supermarket. But remember, we've just done some quite big strategic planning framework exercises. It seems to me, to actually take people out when they've contributed significantly to that strategic framework and chuck them into a completely different one they've had no hand in, that's quite a hard ask. But to create something new is a far easier segue, I believe.
I'm not sure I agree, Jean, because as we discussed before, the community boards did those strategic plans. The wards here are not the same conversation as the community boards. So those community boards and those community board wards would still elect their community board and would still have input into that, wouldn't they?
Not to say it was ever going to be an easy thing, but easier. Yeah.
I believe it's quite an interesting concept that our Chief Executive has just mentioned. Taking all those, it'd be interesting to do the numbers around just Timaru City and everything else, what that comes up at.
5 to 4, and there's about a 7 to 5% difference, so they're within the 10%. Because I kind of think the previous conversation about urban and rural, that's what I had in my mind, as opposed to what's being modelled here, which is all the little urban centres. I kind of think, and Jan's talked about it a lot, how people in those wards like Geraldine, for example, only get to vote for one councillor. This way they could potentially vote for 4. And I think it's an option really worth looking at.
It's certainly something we can model up. Sorry? We can check that, that's fine. And we can, the beauty of the exercise we're going to do shortly is that we can play around with those numbers so that, it's fully transparent, you can see what's going on. And we can certainly model that up for you. Okay, moving on then, if that's okay. Moving to that fourth option, we were asked to have a look at what an urban-rural split might be, and to be clear, what we're about to describe to you is illustrative only. If you wanted to pursue it further, we would need some additional guidance, and I'll get Tash to talk through that in a moment. But effectively, we had to make a significant number of assumptions about what urban or rural might mean and how to draw those boundaries based on the mesh box, because it is certainly not necessarily a tidy exercise. Tash, do you want to explain further about some of those considerations?
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Thanks, Brennan. Sorry about that, guys. Wee bit of an IT glitch. As Brennan was saying, with the urban and rural, it wasn't just as simple as dividing, like sort of, from the town. In this particular case on the maps, I've gone through township outlines as far as our rural. But then if you're also looking at the rural lines too, are you looking at like our small settlements, such as Pearl Forest, Blandswood, Rangitata, that sort of stuff, where you've got the little settlements as well. So do we divide them up was another consideration. Because of the data around appears to be, and our numbers, especially with the census data just for these, is around the mesh blocks, it's kind of, the town outlines are sort of split in between. So for example, we look at Timaru on my GUIS data. I'll just get rid of the highway. You'll see that the mesh blocks which I've divided and the aqua is roughly, Brendan and I had a bit of fun last Friday just to see what it would look like. So we had to make some assumptions with the mesh blocks. So you could see and this is the other thing too, with our assumptions, this is just keeping in mind what we're thinking around the town outline. So this mesh block here, if I go select, and I'll just select that one for you. That mesh block, when it decides to come up, that one in its own right itself, as you can see, part of Timaru from Gleneedy and the golf course, and that comes into it. But then on the other side, as far as here, that's classified as rural, especially. And then I was kind of playing around with the numbers as far as our operative and our proposed district plans. How we've got stuff for our township, central CBD, and then we've also got what's going to be rural lifestyle opposed to rural. And then also what is our urban area. And then we've also got the future development area, which is on the upper part of this mesh block here, which is, you've got that particular area here, which is now becoming a future development area. So it's kind of like, are we doing it as of now? Or are we looking at, how are we going to divide it as far as what to make urban and what to make rural? And every time the mesh block, even if I chucked on, for example, just for a show and tell, if I chucked in the proposed district plan layers, as you can see the different colours that are divided around there, with our town, and if I turn off that one there, and I'll just chuck on our 2023 blocks, and I'll put them on top, you can see the yellow outlines of our mesh blocks around. It's probably not that clear on there, but as you can see, this part here is rural, and then you've got your rural lifestyle there, but then you've got urban all around here. So, and the mesh blocks are sort of divided into the larger areas. So it was just trying to play around with our numbers. What do we consider as urban and rural?
Not sure they were a good choice of words in hindsight. I kind of almost feel like it's in a Timaru, out of Timaru. Or, it's not necessarily rural, urban. It's town and country. Call it whatever you want.
Yeah, that's why I decided to do, or Brendan and I as a team, and Mark decided to do as an outline as far as just our town outlines. I also had a bit of a play with that because of our towns and our urbans, was also more thinking of our rate boundary roles, rate roll boundaries. How we classify when we actually do our rates, how we charge our township people, as far as that goes, as far as getting the mesh blocks in for.
Do the mesh blocks follow the river, the Opahi River? Do they all bound, or do they cross the river?
They cross.
That's silly.
They cross. So, for example, you've got one right.
Because rivers are always a beautiful marker, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because, you think about people in caves, they go on the highway up Pleasant Point straight to Timaru. People in Pleasant Point go up the highway straight to Timaru. Whereas the people in Temuka, they stay on that side of the river. And so do the Geraldine people. Strangely enough, that's what they do. That's why we've got Waitaki and Timaru. That's why people never cross the bridge. Goes right back, to 1800s. It was too difficult.
Could I just add that I think the minister, the rural minister, is trying to define rural right now. Yeah, good luck. Yeah. From a Geraldine perspective, I'd say it's probably important to recognise that it's not just a matter of geography and land area that you live on. There's a lot of cultural stuff in the mix of being rural. So when I take Geraldine, I think about all the agri-sector people living there and retired farmers and so on. And I think they consider themselves rural.
Sorry, is it fair to say that the rural-urban question isn't rural-urban, it's more Timaru Township and the rest? In terms of the...
100%, I don't think this option in front of us is a valid option at all. Yeah, and it's definitely done that, yeah, yeah.
That's why I also calculated on the map that you guys have in front of you. That's also why I put in the totals for, because I thought that you might have wanted to see them for. So within those mesh blocks that I've done around the town outlines, which was hopefully answering your question before, I've got the numbers for as far as approximate numbers from the 2023 for each of those outline townships from where the mesh blocks, and then just taken those mesh blocks around it for those townships. And then you've also got on the top the number for what everything else would be, apart from our townships numbers. That's why I called it rural. So hopefully that answers that question. I'm sorry.
What I'll do is just move on to the next couple of slides so you can just see what...
Just before you do that, the Pariora Cave, Pleasant Point, that ring, when you start adding those numbers up, they're getting up towards 2,000 something. And actually, strangely enough, that road up through to Cave from Pariora, whatever the road's called, and then back through to Pleasant Point, there is sort of some synergy there, isn't it? No? All right.
Again, too, just be advised too that with your mesh blocks, the bigger the mesh block, there may be no one in there. So that's the other thing with the mesh blocks is that with the distance and stuff. So even if you've got that 500 in Pariora, the next mesh blocks that go on that road, there may be no numbers, so it may still be the 500 or 600. When you bring in Timaru into it, yeah, by all means, the further away you go up. Yep, the mesh blocks goes by as actually, all these mesh blocks are actually within our district. Yep, so with our district outline.
I kind of see maybe where you're going through, Nigel, because if you look at Pariora and they don't have stormwater pipes down there, it's just like holes in the footpath. Septic tanks would be maybe similar to what someone in Cave or out the back of Pleasant Point is dealing with as well. So that they're dealing with the same kind of infrastructure service, they've got the same level of service maybe, which is not necessarily what Timaru people have got level of service for. Yeah.
Since you talked about the OP River and what you're saying, Sally, is I'd be keen at looking at the numbers like a southern ward being one side of the OP and a northern ward being the other side of the OP and seeing what those numbers look like. Because I agree there's probably more synergies between Point and Pariora to the Timaru than what, some of those Cave and out the back of Timaru have to the Temuka Pleasant Point ward at the moment.
We can definitely have a play around with the numbers around the rivers and that for the next. I'm more than happy to go on the research for that, yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting, I think we overthink this because you can put a boundary around everything and, you can argue that Geraldine and Temuka only get to vote or not vote, depends whether there was election or not for one councillor and a mayor. but then, you know, they also get to vote for community boards and you don't in town. And actually, if we, you know, went on the community boards versus council and committee meetings, actually you'd say the active democracy sits within the community boards because they were chocolate with public forum and other things. So it's less about boundary for me and more about, and I know we've got to go through this process, but it's actually, you know, it's the conversation that we had this morning around actually attending, you know, Timaru councillors attending those community board members. That's how we take democracy to the people as opposed to the other way around. So I think we can put whatever line on the map, but actually once you're elected, it's about us representing the people in whatever shape or form that looks like. So it's not, yeah. I know that we can kick this around forever and a day, but it's just a line on the map, and they're all within the Timaru district. You do, then you lose rural community representation totally. But that's the problem, isn't it? If you go to the rural, and that's fine, and they could be elected from anywhere, and then you know you could not have a Geraldine councillor. You know, you could have them all sitting in Temuka. So that's the risk that you get by going at large with such an area. So you can be taking representation away, and yeah. So it's a fine balance.
And that's why the identification of the communities of interest are important, so that you know what areas or types of people within your community you're ensuring you represent or need to be represented versus ones that may not need to be.
And I'd just say if that concept were to be progressed, I think it'd be very good to keep it hand in hand with the conversation about community boards.
And we will have that discussion shortly. I'll just quickly zip through these next couple of slides. So fully noting the conversation around urban-rural wards, and I think you've heard clearly we've had to make a number of assumptions to try and mock this up for you. If we were to go along with the assumptions that we've designed, then, for instance, you could achieve a compliance within the plus or minus 10% by having 8 elected members from those urban areas versus 2 from the rural ward. Before we move on to the number of elected members exercise, I just want to pause, because in the previous workshop we heard some discussion around establishment of potentially a Pariora community board, which is possible, or more broadly there might be discussion around the existing community boards. But there's also the opportunity to have at-large members, and this can be in conjunction with wards. Or we might discuss anything else that's within the remit of the representation review. So I just want to pause at this point to see if there's any further discussions around any of that before we look at numbers of elected members.
I must have missed that, the Pariora Community Board. That's the first I've heard of that, so I must have been asleep at the wheel or something. But I just wonder for 500 people. Interesting.
I might be able to help you there. I think the question was thrown out, should they have a community board? How is council engaging with that community? Is there another way other than a community board? And I think the Mayor referenced an existing working group or something like that that was working with them. So just simply raising that again so that we can make sure that we're clear on what the guidance may or may not be that you'd like us to model.
Yeah, look, and actually getting representatives even for that group has been a challenge in its own right, just because of population. Yeah, so it's, yeah. It's something we'll continue to work at, but yeah.
Any thoughts on any other community boards or at-large members?
I'd just like at-large to be, talked about properly. Last time it wasn't much on the table at all. And of course there are issues there for us in Geraldine. When it comes to the councillor level, we get to vote on, we've got a say in one person who's making decisions on our behalf. So it needs to be out there on the table.
One thing I can certainly say to that is that it will be regardless of what council resolves to do in terms of initial proposal and for community consultation, it will be highlighted as an option through the community consultations that we can receive feedback.
I'm not sure how the argument holds though. The problem is that, in a general election, we got to vote for, one individual and a party, slightly different. But, we've only got one individual representing us out of 120 members, ultimately. I just think, I personally think that, no offence, but it's a narrow view when you're just thinking that one person around the council table is representing your community of, Yeah, and that's the thing. No, totally.
My point is that it gets discussed. I'm not necessarily an advocate for at large. I'm an advocate for it being discussed around the district.
I think more the point Jan is making is that Councillor Jackson gets to vote for 6 people around this table. And I only get to vote for none, actually, because there wasn't an election, but yeah, you get the point. Whereas, Jan can only vote for one person who sits around this table. And it's not about, once we're here, who we represent. It's more, you're only having a say. Whereas your point about a general election, that's the same up and down the country. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And I mean, going back, the at-large conversation nearly destroyed the council back in whenever it was. It was before you, Sally, I think, wasn't it, when they had that? It was the Team Timaru years, and they, nearly had it over the line. And I think if that got over the line, then you'd have probably 10 representatives from Timaru looking after the whole district, and that's the challenge with that conversation.
I think the conversation, though, is more the understanding that by having a award system, that is what you forfeit, and that is the price to pay of a award system, and you might be absolutely 100% happy with that price, but that is the price you're paying, yeah.
I think, sorry, to finish before you jump in, Councillor Booth, I think what people forget is actually the representation is straight away when Geraldine's got a vote, and not always, but I would say 9 times out of 10, the communities pretty much get what is recommended through from the community board level. Straight away, you've got the rural councillors and normally the mayor on your side. So you get up to a 4 to 6 as far as our democracy goes. So you only need, 1 and a bit and you're there. So, I just argue that the representation is actually there. And the model, if you stepped away from the model, then that's when you probably put and go at large, that's when you risk the community boards.
I guess I was just going to mention that it's really up to the wards to put strong people forward who are going to represent you. And so a good competition out in your rural area and identifying the people who are going to come in and participate and contribute is probably the most important thing that can happen. So ultimately that's up to the local community.
Haven't we currently got a halfway house? Because effectively, Timaru is at large, and then you've got some rural wards, and I always thought of wards all being sort of equal size. So if you've got, if you've got 48,000 people, you might have 10 wards of 4,800 or whatever the number works out to be. But we don't do that. We sort of have this mixed. We're really mixed.
Did have, not talking about you, Councillor Scott, but we did have people from outside of the Timaru ward standing in like we had somebody from Temuka standing in the Timaru ward, so that was kind of effectively at large, yeah.
I got voted in, thank you very much. Lived here all my life, thank you very much.
She did originate from the Glenetti ward.
Well, it sounds like we may be able to move on.
I think we need to.
I think what's been highlighted is, number one, there are trade-offs no matter what system you go for. And secondly, the legislation requires number one, that there is the plus or minus 10% threshold, which means that populations need to be broadly represented equally, whereas under a different legislative model, take America for instance, each of the 50 states gets 2 senators, so someone in Wyoming has, from a senator perspective, the exact same weight, far more weight than, say, someone from California. They've got a completely different philosophy around it and legislative framework. Ours is different, and we work within the model that we have.
God bless America.
Someone probably needs to.
Someone needs to.
This workshop is deviated. Right, what I'd like to do now, and I'm conscious of time, there's around 15 minutes or so left with an hour allotted slot, which is probably pretty good. What I'd like to do is ask you to take the opportunity to pop to the email link that I sent you yesterday and go to your designed or designated spreadsheet. You've each got a separate one so that you can't overlay each other's work. What this is designed to do, and we'll do it for 5 minutes or so, maybe 10, is we've looked at communities of interest, which is the first building block. We've then looked at how you effectively represent those communities of interest, and yes, there's discussion around what the communities of interest are, but that's fine. So how do you effectively represent them? Now we then move to the third stage, which is how do you fairly represent them, where, relatively speaking, votes are cast of equal weight if there's indeed a ward system. So I'm not sure we can bring it up on the screen unless, Tash, you're able to go to the link. Apologies to anyone watching online that they don't have access to this. So hopefully what this will do, if you go through the various of the 4 or 5 options that we've modelled for you, is you can plug in a couple of numbers. You could, for instance, say, I quite like option 2A, for instance, regarding Orari, but I feel that we need a different number of elected members to accurately and effectively represent that community. Maybe just pop into Councillor Piddington, seeing as he's an apology. Councillors Burt and Oliver might be using theirs remotely. Yeah, pop into that one, why not? To be clear, I don't expect us to do this as a group on the screen via Tash, etc. What I want to do is pause for a few minutes, go offline, give you an opportunity to play around with these numbers. Please only play around with the column for elected members. If you play around with some of the other ones, the formulas, then it will distort the results. But we'll just pause for 5 minutes or so, let you do that. I'll come around and then we'll bring it back together. Is that okay? Cool. Again, I feel like the teacher.